では続きましてですね、本題に入る前に本日のテーマにふさわしく先住民伝統の開会儀式になります。こちらのですね、ご担当は、本日のですね、カナダのご報告者のお一人でいらっしゃいますサリー・バンティングさんにお願いしております。サリーさん、ご準備ができましたら説明も含めて、儀式お願いします。サリーさん、どうぞよろしくお願いします。
If they can see you, okay.
Oh, it's okay, Sally, you can start.
Oh, okay. We always do this in anything that's very important to us and to the people that we're trying to teach. We have to pray to the Great Spirit so we can get that thing across what we're trying to teach. So that's why we always pray in the beginning and at the end that everything will go well. Okay, so I will pray now and okay, miigwes kasi man ito no gumuhiwe kaganwa pam siyang go guys tigyan. Uega sin mauj kabza dagon. Kasi man to mauj go samin sinam koyak chito tamang hiwe koyak chikinamagyang koyak chigo chikinda muach hiwe nigaw when gaw kinhamongich. How nagske with the agama kingaya watch how nag koyak chikinhamongich koyak chikinda muach hiwe ni kago kinhamagyang. Miswem no kay nagsimanto miigwes kakana mojagatin hiwe. Miigwes. Amen. Okay.
You want to say what?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
サリーさん、どうもありがとうございます。では次はですね、大会のご挨拶になります。こちらは国際ソーシャルワーク協会会長の、日本女子大学名誉教授の木村真理子先生にお願いしております。木村先生は対面会場より登壇されます。木村先生、よろしくお願いします。木村先生、対面会場のマイクとカメラをオンにしていただければと思います。はい、よろしくお願いします。
はい、お願いします。じゃあ、このまま使わない。聞こえた。はい、世界中のソーシャルワーカーと兄弟姉妹の皆様、本日は国際研究セミナーにご参加いただきありがとうございます。私、国際ソーシャルワーク協会会長、代表理事の木村真理子です。国際研究セミナーを開催するにあたり、組織を代表してご挨拶申し上げます。開会にあたりまして、新たに設立されました一般社団法人国際ソーシャルワーク協会の創設の趣旨と、本日の研究セミナーの講師の紹介をさせていただきます。本日の国際研究セミナーは、一般社団法人国際ソーシャルワーク協会の設立を記念する特別イベントとして位置づけられています。私たちは2017年から任意団体国際ソーシャルワーク研究会として活動してまいりました。この間、組織としてより幅広い国際ソーシャルワークの事業を展開していきたいとの志を持ち、発起人の間で協議を重ねてまいりました。今後は一般社団法人国際ソーシャルワーク協会としてスタートすることを正式に決定し、法務局の登記を経て、2023年5月10日に正式に一般社団法人国際ソーシャルワーク協会としてスタートする運びとなりました。国際ソーシャルワークの定義や活動領域の一端は、2022年3月に中央法規から出版されました 協調、国際ソーシャルワークを知る、世界で活躍するための理論と実践、木村小原武田協調の記事でございます。本書に採用しております定義に基づき、協会の定款では新たな組織の目的、活動を以下のように定めています。日本国内およびアジア太平洋地域におけるソーシャルワーク専門職および当該専門職団体の組織化と機能の強化を目的として、国際ソーシャルワークの開発支援、国際協力、国際交流、調査研究、教育研修等を通じて、これらの国々における人権の擁護と福祉の増進に寄与することを目指します。その目的を達するために次の授業を行います。1、国際ソーシャルワークの実践及び調査研究。2、国際ソーシャルワークの教育、研修を通じた普及啓発。3、国際ソーシャルワークに関する情報提供及び関係組織との連携調整。4、その他、この法人の目的を達するために必要な事業を行うとしています。協会はこれまで任意で無料で参加という方針を改め、新たな会員組織に変更いたします。これまで研究会の会員としてご参加いただきました方々には、新たな組織にぜひご入会いただき、活動をお支えいただくとともに、活動にご参加いただきたくお願いする次第です。本日は記念行事として、新しい組織の出発を記念する研究セミナーを開催しております。テーマは、カナダにおける先住民ソーシャルワークの歴史的発展と進化する実践モデル、社会政策と先住民固有の地に基づく精神保健福祉アプローチに焦点を当ててです。セミナーの講師は、カナダの旧知の友人で、共にソーシャルワーク大学院博士課程で学んだ同僚で研究者でもあります、ジョイス・ティンプソン博士、並びにインディジナス・メンタルヘルスワーカーのリディア・シャーマンとサリー・バンティングをお招きしています。本日のセミナーはハイブリッドのウェビナー形式で開催しています。すでに300名を超える方にご登録いただいており、このトピックに対する国際的な関心の高さを伺い知ることができます。本日の国際研究セミナーの開催にあたり、共催をいただいております日本ソーシャルワーク学会、講演をいただきました日本ソーシャルワーク教育学校連盟、並びに日本ソーシャルワーカー連盟、そして各研機により、このセミナーの企画運営と原稿の翻訳にご尽力いただいております、ビラーグ・ビクトリさんに心より感謝申し上げます。皆様には本日の研究セミナーの成果をより多くの方々と共有していただけましたら、この上ない喜びでございます。また、セミナーにご参加いただきました皆様には、引き続き新しい法人組織、国際ソーシャルワーク協会へのご支援、ご入会、企画へのご参加をいただきたくお勧め申し上げます。それでは本日のセミナー、最後までご視聴いただきますようお願い申し上げます。ありがとうございました。
はい、木村先生、どうもありがとうございました。ではですね、続きまして、私よりセミナー趣旨のご説明と、ご報告者の紹介をさせていただきたいと思います。先ほどですね、木村先生よりもありましたけれども、本日の企画は、国際ソーシャルワーク協会、日本ソーシャルワーク学会、そしてご覧の各研費事業の共催によって実現しております。また、講演団体としては、日本ソーシャルワーカー連盟と、日本ソーシャルワーク教育学校連盟にご支援をいただいております。誠にありがとうございます。申し遅れましたが、本日の司会モデレーターを務めさせていただきます、日本社会事業大学のウィラーグと申します。また、画面にはですね、残念ながら映る機会はございませんが、モデレーションのですね、 補助をルーテル学院大学の浅野先生にですね、お願いしております。大変助かっております。本日のスケジュールですが、すでにですね、趣旨説明に入っております。これからですね、皆さんのですね、プロフィールも紹介した上で、カナダの皆さんより現場報告をしていただきます。その後ですね、時間が許す限り簡単な休憩を進めまして、指定コメント、そして質問に移ります。その後、これらの質問への、ご回答を終えてディスカッション、質疑応答を展開したいと思います。場合によってはですね、一般会場の皆さん、あるいはですね、オンライン参加の皆さんより質問をいただく機会がございませんので、もちろんですね、時間が許す限り頑張りますが、時間が切れた場合は大変申し訳ございません。あらかじめご了承ください。そして最後にですね、閉会挨拶と閉会の儀式となります。ではですね、本日のテーマというですね、この先住民とソーシャルワークということですけれども、ご参加の皆さんもご存知の通り、ソーシャルワーク専門職のですね、グローバル定義には、地域民族固有の地、とりわけ先住民の地というですね、ことが特に重視されているというふうにですね、日本のですね、締約にも脚注で書いてありますけれども、そういったものですね、専門的な地ではなくて、こういった先住民固有の地も、ソーシャルワークの基盤としてですね、この定義は規定しております。そして定義のですね、注釈には、特にですね、この関連で先住民を含めたですね、植民地主義のですね、経験してきた植民地の悪影響についてですね、一段落、二段落ぐらい述べられております。この中にはですね、先住民の定義としては、こちらでですね、並べている4つのですね、要件に当てはまる民族をですね、IFSW は国連のですね、定義に基づいてしているというふうに書いてありますが、もちろんですね、本日のメインのテーマでありますカナダのファーストネーション、そして実は日本のアイヌも、これらの項目に該当するということになります。本日はですね、カナダの皆さんのご報告がメインになりますけれども、日本サイトではこのような企画を主催する意義としてですね、ちょっとスライドをですね、数枚使って日本のアイヌについて簡単に説明したいと思います。特にですね、このアイヌ民族の先住地である北海道をはじめとしたですね、周辺地域、北方領土などのカラフトなどの地域の植民地化に関するデータをですね、ちょっと見ていただきたいと思いますけれども、これはですね、明治時代から昭和5年、1930年までの大体ですね、60年間にわたる北海道人口のですね、推移を示してますけれども、ご覧の通り、アイヌ人口は1万5000人ぐらいで大体一定でありながら、北海道人口がどんどん増えているということになります。これによって、もうすでに1930年という時点で、アイヌの皆さんは自分たちのですね、先住地であったはずの北海道ですら 0.6% というですね、極小マイノリティという立場に追い込まれてしまっているということが分かります。これはですね、先のデータを少しですね、図で示しているようなグラフですけれども、この下のところですね、この四角がついている線ですが、これアイヌ人口を示していますね。これ明治時代にわたってずっと一定でありながら、この三角が載っている線で示している北海道全体のですね、人口が増えているということになりますね。そして、この棒は、この点がついている棒グラフは何でしょうかということですが、これはですね、土地の払い下げということで、これ実はですね、かつてのですね、北海道の大自然、アイヌの先住地がこういうふうにですね、私有化されていくというですね、ことを示してますけれども、じゃあこういうふうに分譲された先住地はじゃあね、この人口比率から考えると、誰の手に渡っていったのでしょうかということをですね、考えると多分図からですね、お分かりになるかなというふうに思います。で、これらのですね、歴史的な背景を踏まえて、内閣官房がですね、出している報告書にはですね、植民地主義の歴史については、こういうふうにまとめられています。ちょっと要点だけを取り上げますけれども、まとめですね、この時代、ね、植民地化の 流れの中で、土地政策、そして同化政策などにより、先住民族であるアイヌの文化は深刻な打撃を受けたと、そして非支配的な立場に追い込まれたと、また様々な局面で差別を受けてきたというふうに、こちらの行政が出している報告書に書いてあります。そしてこういったですね、植民地主義の歴史があることも踏まえて、本日もですね、現代でもアイヌの方々の多くは、北海道内外を問わず、さまざまな社会問題に直面しているんですね。データも出ていますが、本日はですね、詳しい数字は挙げませんけれども、例えばですね、貧困とか低所得に関する数字だったりとか、教育に関する問題とか、依存などのメンタルヘルスの問題、特にですね、この最後の点は、本日のですね、テーマとも深く関連がありますので、ということで、このようなですね、日本の現状も考えて、本日はですね、カナダの関連実践から学びましょうということで、この企画を立ち上げました。では、じゃあ、どなたから学ぶかということですけれども、簡単にですね、本日のご報告者の方々を紹介したいと思います。まず、ジョイス・ティムソンさんですけれども、ジョイスさんはカナダのトロント出身でありながら、現在はスールカートというですね、地域に住んでおります。こちらの地域はですね、30カ所の先住民コミュニティの遠隔サービス拠点として、オンタリオ州のですね、自治体ですけれども、そこでですね、40年間にわたって、あらゆるですね、側面から先住民の生死保健福祉サービスに従事してきました。そして本日のですね、共同報告者の方々と共に、カナダで初めて先住民の当事者ワーカーによる生死保健福祉サービスの開発に取り組んできました。また、25年前にですね、博士号を取られた後でも、開発途上のですね、北方先住民コミュニティにおいて、当事者によって企画、運営されている生死保健福祉及び依存症関連事業のコンサルタントも務めてきていらっしゃいます。そしてですね、スールカートのですね、実は自治体議員にもですね、当選して、もうすでにですね、17年間にわたって政治家として、特に環境問題、そしてその自治体と先住民の関係を中心に活動してこられています。ちょっとですね、プライベートな内容ですけれども、ジョイスさんはですね、このね、北のですね、気候は大変ですね、好んで、冬にはですね、クロスカントリースキー、そして夏にはスイミングを楽しんでいるそうです。そして今日はですね、2番目に語っていただきます、リディア・シャーマンさんです。リディアさんは、おじきり語でですね、丸い湖というですね、ことを意味する、ウィーガモウ語の先住地で生まれ育ちました。自分のですね、母語、継承語を流暢に話せるおじきりの先住民女性です。同じくですね、40年間にわたって、さらにですね、この北方の地域、コミュニティから飛行機でですね、来て来所してくる皆さんのですね、こういった遠隔の30人のファーストネーション先住民コミュニティのサービス拠点であるですね、先ほどの同じスールカートですね、というところで、活動して、そちらに住んでいらっしゃいます。35年にわたって、生死保健福祉、そして児童福祉をですね、含む先住民ソーシャルワーク分野で実践してきました。そしてですね、本日のですね、共同報告者ではジョイスさん、そして後ほど紹介するサリーさんと一緒に、1980年代のですね、初頭に、また、同じくですね、同時に、先住民長老2人、そして、他の先住民、ね、今日の、リディアさんご自身、そしてサリーさんと同じような先住民当事者の生死保健福祉分野のカウンセラーさん、ワーカーさんと共同して、カナダで初めての先住民による生死保健福祉事業の立ち上げに取り組んできました。この6年間の間ですね、先住民団体の生死保健福祉チームにおいて、生死保健福祉カウンセラーとして、今でもずっと活動しておられます。趣味はですね、とても多彩で、読書、ギター、歌、そして孫と遊ぶことね、を含んでいますけれども、リディアさんはですね、多文化、日本文化も含めてですが、異なる文化、多くの文化に大変関心があって、また自然も大好きな方でいらっしゃいます。 そして本日ですね、3番目にですね、語っていただくのは、サリー・バンティングさんです。サリー・バンティングさんはノーススピリット、日本語に直訳すると北の神というですね、名前の湖から名付けられた先住地で生まれ育ちました。同じく自分の母語、自分の継承語、オジキリ語を流暢に話せる先住民女性で、現在はスールカートの近くにあるドライデン市にですね、お住まいです。1983年、ね、実は私自身が生まれた年ですけれども、なかなか歴史感じますけれども、その私が生まれた時にですね、本日の共同報告書でいらっしゃいますジョイスさん、そしてリディアさんと、カナダで初めてのですね、先住民接触権福祉事業において、始まった、約20年間のですね、専門的なキャリアをお持ちです。でこのキャリアをですね、2回中断したことがありまして、何のために中断したかと申し上げますと、ご自身のですね、民族において女性として初めて族長を務めるためでした。現在はドライデンの高校のですね、長老カウンセラーを務めていらっしゃいます。そこでドライデン市、あるいは近くのですね、他のコミュニティより、あるいはそれこそですね、遠隔のコミュニティより、通っているですね、先住民当事者の生徒たちの支援に取り組んでいらっしゃいます。本日のご報告の中では、こちらの活動についても教えていただきます。またですね、ご自身のですね、継承語、母語をですね、流暢に話せるというですね、先住民女性でいらっしゃいますので、より自分よりもさらに年配のですね、長老たちとコミュニケーションを取れるという強みがあって、その中で伝統的な技法を学びながら、最近はですね、冬に向けたブルーベリーなどの保存、あるいはその他の自然に、ね、帰る自然帰還運動を探求中だそうです。そしてですね、もちろんですね、こういった長い接触権福祉実践のですね、ご経験もありますけれども、それを問わずやっぱりご自身がですね、ご自身のですね、一番大事な役割として何を考えているかと申し上げると、それは自分のですね、つながっている13人のですね、孫、そして、もう亡くなっていらっしゃいますけれども、岩夫のですね、ディーンさんのですね、の9人の孫、これらのですね、合わせると21人のですね、若者、子どもたちの祖母を務めることがですね、やっぱ自分の最も大事な役割であるというふうに確信していらっしゃるそうです。ということで、素晴らしいですね、講師陣を本日迎えておりますので、早速ですね、バトンタッチして、ジョイスさんより順番でご報告をお願いしたいと思います。ジョイスさん、よろしくお願いします。スライドの操作はこちらで行います。
Thank you. Thank you, Victor and Mariko. And thank you so much for inviting us. When I was asked to do this, I knew that I could not do it alone as a non-Indigenous person. So I invited both Sally and Lydia to work with me because they were among the first Indigenous people in this area to take on mental health counseling. Not only that, but they have stayed in this field for 40 years for most of them. And that is, I think, a record up here. And so next slide, please, Victor. Just to show you where we are, in this map, we are about where my cursor is in Northern Ontario. This is in Ontario, and Ontario is about the size of Japan, but we have just 14 million people in Ontario. Canada has 10 million square kilometers with 40 million people, which I understand is the population of Greater Tokyo. Northwestern Ontario, right here and here, is about a third the size of Japan, but with 30,000 people and 30 to 32 fly-in communities. Okay, next slide. Just again, this is Sioux Lookout, population of about 6,000, and it's basically the center and the hub of the North. As you can see, we're surrounded by lakes and wilderness, and this is our town right here. Okay, next slide. The Ojibwe people are in the southern part here. Cree people are in the northern part here. And in between are people that have a mixed race between Cree and Ojibwe, and that's where the OG Cree came from. Next. Just to give you an idea, we're talking about very small fly-in communities from a population of about 50 to 3,000. And as you can see, they're in the middle of wilderness. All the communities now have airports, and you can fly into them in a regular sched, but that has not always been the case. Okay, next slide. And just to explain, Indigenous people in Canada are very diverse. There are a group we call First Nations, we used to be called Indians. There are about 1 million First Nations people, but there are 70 distinct languages. 50% live on reserve lands set aside by the government, and the rest live in urban settings. And then the Inuit are the people that are in the very, very far north of Canada. And the Métis, there's about 70,000 Inuit. And the Métis, there's about estimated 700,000 persons who would be considered mixed race. So they're very diverse. And just to keep in mind that the experience that we're going to be presenting is unique to this area. And although across Canada, the situations are similar among Indigenous people with the similar kind of history, the isolation of the North is very unique. Next, please. Just a little bit of history, because I think the history is important. European explorers were looking for a shorter sea route to India and China and they landed on the east coast of the Americas around 1500 AD. And they think they probably landed around the Caribbean first. Okay, these are pictures of the kinds of boats that they used at that time. Okay, next. The white explorers met people who had brown skin, and they thought they had reached India, so they called the people Indians. Now we use the word Indigenous because it's to refer to all people that were here before the Europeans, because it's a far more appropriate word to use. Okay, next. Okay. Now, the Indigenous people were viewed by the Europeans as savages. And this concept alone shaped so much of government policy, which was to assimilate the Indigenous people into white society and destroy their Indigenous culture. Even practicing Indigenous ceremonies was outlawed. Next, please. And I'll just, it's important to just describe how things have changed in the North since contact with the Europeans. Next slide. This just gives you an example. In old days, people traveled with birch bark canoes that were made out of the bark of trees. And now people have modern motorboats. Next. The way people traveled back by dog sled, could walk with snowshoes, and now people have snowmobiles, they're called, and modern trucks. And this change has occurred in less than 1 century. Did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Next, please. Here's a picture of a teepee where this family was living. Again, it's made out of some sort of material, but traditionally they were often made out of birch bark. And again, here is a modern building. Next, please. Today, the North is a mix of traditional and new, with many land-based practices in modern settings, living with technology. Here's a picture of some Indigenous women cutting up a moose that had been caught. These are pictures of stretching beaver hide, and this is a stretching of a polar bear hide. And here you have a satellite that receives television signals, internet, and so on. Next. So rapid change, these fast changes plus many losses and failed policies have shaped mental health problems in the North. Next, please. Social determinants of health are very important and apply in these situations. We could spend an entire day on each of these, but we're picking out only a few to focus on that appear to be the most important in terms of the North. Access to health services, childhood experiences, culture and racism, lack of understanding of culture. Next, please. We're going to talk about 3 major issues that really have shaped today. Tuberculosis, residential schools, and extension of provincial services. Next. So tuberculosis. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was rampant. Many people were flown to special hospitals hundreds of miles away, often gone for years. Many died, and their bodies were not returned for funerals, resulting in much unresolved grief. Here's a picture of the old float planes that would fly up to the communities and take a sick person to a hospital like this old one now in Sioux Lookout. Next, please. Diabetes. There was a drastic change in diet from plants and game harvested from the land to high carbohydrates and processed foods. This caused the diabetes rate to become very high. Poverty and the high price of good food is a contributor to diabetes. And diabetes has resulted in amputations, vision problems, and premature deaths. Next. Secondly, the church-run residential schools. From 1880 to the 1960s, about 150,000 children were forcibly removed from parents and home communities to church-run residential schools, hundreds of kilometers away from their communities. The goal was assimilation and destruction of Indigenous culture. After 1960, attendance was voluntary, but the results were similar. Next. Here's just a picture of the kids in residential school. This is a picture of the residential school that is close to Sioux Lookout. And these are pictures of kids from various places. And you can see that they were made to look like white children. Their hair was cut, white people's clothing. And in this picture here, you see the many nuns and priests with these kids. And to see the nuns in long black cloaks must have been very terrifying to these children, as well as everything else that was happening to them. Next, please. They were kids removed at a vulnerable age. Sometimes they went home for summers, sometimes not at all. Their hair was cut when they arrived, were deloused, given white people's clothes, and punished for speaking their language. Next. The churches demonized indigenous spiritual practices, resulting in many First Nations rejecting them, their spiritual practices. Many children were traumatized for life by cruel punishments, sexual and physically abused by clergy, staff, and other students. Next. When the children returned home, they did not know the traditional ways and their language, had difficulty relating to their culture, parents, and grandparents, and had to relearn parenting due to bad modeling at the schools. Next. Now, around 1965 was a particularly important era when Canada was trying to equalize services, and the First Nations were not receiving the same services as everybody else. So in order to address that, the government moved a lot of people off their traditional land to new locations so that they would have access to services like education. There were some communities were flooded by dams. People were forced to relocate. Now we know that relocation disrupts natural kinship systems. It affected the natural economy, taking away people from their natural hunting grounds, and the ability to hunt and gather food from the land was greatly affected. Next. So at the same time, people became, the Indigenous people became eligible for welfare, which before they were not if they were on reserve. So with the decline of traditional economies and introduction of welfare, not to mention the disruption in kinship and residential schools, we really had a very, very serious situation among Indigenous people at that time that was a result of policies that were thought to be helpful. Now, getting back to welfare payments, a lot of people believed that, a lot of Indigenous people believed that the introduction of welfare was probably one of the worst things that could have happened. Next. So we get into the whole concept of intergenerational effects, how all these things that happened, they become self-perpetuating and go down to the next generation. Next, please. Next. And in Canada, the intergenerational effects are seen in similar kinds of statistics that was described for the Ainu people. Suicide among Indigenous people is 5 to 6 times higher than the rest of Canada. And in some isolated places, it's even much higher than that. Addictions, children in foster care, Indigenous children are about 50% of all children in foster care. Incarceration, 27% of the population in prison is Indigenous, while only 4% of the population is Indigenous. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and the violence against Indigenous women is very high. Next. The effects of so many losses and unresolved grief on today's situations. Suicides have traumatized entire communities. If you can imagine a community of 500 people losing 30 young members over the course of 40 years. You can, when everybody is related, you can just imagine how traumatizing that would be. And sometimes these suicides occur in clusters, and sometimes several in consecutive days. Next, please. Opioid addiction is extremely high, with estimates of in possibly 75% of the adults in some communities who are addicted. And this is what we are seeing today as a result of several generations of multiple and complex losses and abuse that resulted in some people describing Indigenous people to be in a chronic state of post-traumatic stress disorder. Next. So just to summarize, multiple losses, often at the same time, from illnesses, deaths, language, children, loss of children, accidents, drownings, plane crashes, loss associated with homicide and murder, and unresolved grief, which is really an important concept here, which results in more loss and tragedy passed down to later generations. Next. So how do we address the issues? Next. So around 1980s in this particular area, it was really obvious that the services had to be, new approaches had to be found for these services. And so that was when services began to be transferred to Indigenous groups. Next. Non-Indigenous workers often mistook culture-specific symptoms as a sign of a serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, when it may have been a reaction to a life event like complex grief, a reaction that was more pertaining to the culture, that was different from a reaction that they might see in their own European culture. Next. And these programs were introduced in mainstream agencies in child welfare, in mental health. And the paraprofessional model was adopted, in which Indigenous people who are natural helpers, but with experience, would receive training on the job to provide social work and mental health services in child welfare and mental health agencies. Next. And Sally and Lydia were among the first Indigenous mental health workers in our area, and likely the longest serving in our area. And this is a picture of Lydia. And this is a picture of Sally working with one of the elder community workers, who is a very strong guiding principle in that program. Okay, next. After Indigenous workers were hired, people could receive services in their own language, and we began to see more disclosures of the trauma that had been experienced in the previous generations. People were now able to talk in their own language to these workers. And as I said before, non-Indigenous workers often misdiagnosed symptoms when Indigenous workers could recognize symptoms as a different expression of reactions to a problem in living. Child welfare workers were able to find alternate arrangements to taking children in care. Rather than making them foster children or taking them out of the community, they would know other alternatives for them. Next, please. So the key approaches that we use were Indigenous control and design of services. That is key. Considering intergenerational effects, taking a trauma-informed approach, and using culture for healing. And doing this, often using the narrative approach, allowing people to tell their story. Rather than getting into, deep analysis, allowing people to talk and tell their story. Next, please. So I'm going to go into a few of the changes in government policies to address these past mistakes. Okay, next, please. So now there are news facilities for Indigenous people. This is the old hospital. It's falling down, very decrepit. It was very decrepit for many, many decades. And now we have this new Indigenous designed hospital. And it's called Menayawan Health Center, which means in Ojibwe Wellness Health Center. And the board of directors of this hospital must be, by law, 2/3 Indigenous. So that's how things have changed in a relatively short time. Next, please. There's a modern high school, an exact location where the old residential school was. Now, high school students can travel from the north to Sioux Lookout, and they live in group homes with lots of support. And this has been a very successful approach to education. The kids can go home on holidays. They go home for the summer. It's a shorter term. They have a special curriculum condensed so that they aren't away from their families as much as they used to be. Next, please. Teachings of the ancestors are being revived and taught in the school. This is teaching a powwow lesson. This is learning to process wild rice. Next, please. The elders are teaching the children. Next, please. Including making some beautiful traditional crafts. Next, please. Adopting teachers of ancestors, and I think Lydia will go into this a little bit more. Next. And some recent government actions have been a very long Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which thousands of survivors of the residential schools were interviewed, and there are 94, sorry, that says 97, it should be 94 recommendations to correct the wrongs of the schools and loss of culture. The government has made reparation for victims and reparations of children removed from their parents. There's been an inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women. Initiatives are in place to find and return remains of children who died in the schools but were never returned home, and increasing control of services to Indigenous people. Next. And most importantly, Indigenous activism is quite robust in Canada now. Here's pictures of a couple of demonstrations of people. Next, please. Economic development. There are development of Indigenous businesses. A lot of Indigenous groups are purchasing existing businesses and then are being run by the First Nation to address employment, poverty, and housing issues, and development of more addiction treatment centers controlled and staffed by Indigenous persons. Next. Different approaches to commitment of criminal acts, housing initiatives, increased educational opportunities and health careers in all areas. Next. But most of all, partnerships are really essential between government and Indigenous people to address the Indigenous mental health issues. And here's a picture of back in the days of when the early Europeans came, working with an Indigenous group. And here we have a former premier of one of our provinces shaking hands with one of the grand chiefs of the area, and this was in Alberta. So, okay, next. So basically, that's our background, and I thank you very much, miigwech in Ojikri, and arigato in Japanese. And I'd now like to turn it over to Lydia Sherman. And if Lydia would turn off her mute and her video.
Hello, bonjour. My name is Lydia Sherman. I live in Sulakaut. North of us are 32 small communities, all fly-in communities except 2. I am Indigenous First Nations. I am fluent in my language, Ojibwe. Growing up, my dad was a fisherman in the summer and a trapper in the winter. We went camping in the springtime, all summer and part of the fall. We ate fish, wild food, moose meat, rabbits, ducks, geese, etc., and various berries. We moved from campsite to campsite as we followed the movements of the wildlife, including the fish. My mom cooked on wood stove or made fire outside to cook, to make bannock. Bannock is a form of bread and tea, paired coffee. We ate mostly berries and raspberries. My dad was also a hunter, and we lived from the land. We lived in tents for the summer, spring, and fall months. We lived off the land, water, and nature. Move, please. We were surrounded by nature, trees, and lakes. We loved nature. It was healing and healthy to be around nature. Sometime in my early 20s, I finished a 2-year business course in college. I had no interest in business. Turn, please. Although
Oh, Lydia, please wait a second. We are working on it. なんでつらないんだろう。Please wait a second. We will solve the problem in a second.
all right.
もうできました。大丈夫。いや、こっちで上げさせてください。Oh, please, you can go on. I'm sorry.
All right. Although my dad wanted me to take business, my heart was not in. Turn, please.
Oh, Lydia, can you see the screen?
I think you still have to back up a little bit.
Oh, I think your heart was not in business.
Okay,
My heart was with people.
my heart was with my people. I wanted to help people and be with them. In my late teens and early 20s, I lost a brother and a very close friend, both tragically. There was no counseling and support available back then. I did find a place, a refuge to go to, I called it. People at that time took me in and occasionally and listened. This led me in my early 20s to know that I wanted to be in the helping field. I wanted to reach out to people and help them, adults, children, young people, families, and older people. Turn, please. I worked in the social work mental health field 35 plus years inclusive. In the past 5 years, I have been working with the First Nations organization as a mental health counselor with a mental wellness team. In the early 1980s, I started working with mental health at the old Zone Hospital, where Joyce showed you a picture of it. Initially, there were 2 non-Indigenous counselors doing this work. Sometime in the early 80s, they recognized the need for First Nations counselors who knew their culture and the language. We started with 2 counselors and expanded to 4 or 6 First Nations counselors. Some of us traveled and flew to the north. And there's a plane that we used to fly in. Upon arrival in a small northern community, we sometimes stayed in a small one-room cabin with no running water or electricity. Eventually, there was running water and electricity in the little cabins. Turn, please. We would stay up there for 1 week to work. Sometimes we traveled with a psychiatrist and worked with him or her. Sometimes a nurse worked in the community, sometimes not. Right from the beginning of working in this field, we were trained in you have to back up a little bit. Sorry. Right from the beginning of working in this field, we were trained in various mental health aspects and basic counseling skills by the mental health clinical staff and by psychiatrists. We also worked with 3 elders, 2 female and 1 male. The elders that worked alongside with us provided support and training from the cultural aspect. An elder that worked with us said that our work is like the wind. He said something like this: we cannot see the wind. Sometimes we hear and see the effects of the wind. He said the wind can be calm and destructive. He also said the wind can be a guide. He said when we work and see people, we cannot see their emotions or feelings.
We don't know what they're carrying inside. Turn, please. We don't know what they're carrying inside their heart. There could be a lot of sadness, confusion, anxiety in their life. He said, listen and be patient. This is their time and not your time. Sometimes it will take time. That's our job, to find out what is bothering them. Where do they want to find help in? He said, walk the walk of the person that you're working with. Guide them in the path they are walking on. He also said we can help them by teaching, by talking to them, and vice versa. But they might have other physical needs, like having no water or needing help with wood, which we cannot overlook. So in the early years of my work, I looked at all the needs of the individual. What I worked with, I called the sphere. It's like a circle. It involves the physical, emotions, psychological, and spiritual of the individual. Indigenous social workers are now called as a medicine wheel. I had not heard that name before, and just knew that was how I was to approach the person. And there's a picture of the sphere, what I call the sphere, the mind, body, emotion, and spiritual. As time went on, when in the helping field, I traveled to the northern communities to work. Rather than working in an office or a box, as some people called it, which felt isolating for some people, I took advantage of seeing and taking people out to nature, as I grew up with nature as a young child. It appeared to be more therapeutic to the client to go out to the nature and sit by the shore, by the lake, or by the banks of the river, watching the busy beaver going back and forth building his home, listening to the sound of nature like small waterfalls, watching slow-moving rapids was more therapeutic for the individual. It enhanced their physical, emotional, and turn please, and spiritual strength. It appeared each time it was the process of sharing and healing was taking place. As many people have difficulty explaining their emotions as a result of residential schools, I also used non-verbal methods of expressing emotions, such as art therapy, or having a person make a collage of their life. It was another way of helping and forming communications with individuals who needed assistance in communication by writing and drawing. It slowly helped individuals in moving on with counseling. Art therapy benefited some individuals under the guidance of the art therapist. We learned what some of the drawings meant. For example, if the picture is all dark, it might mean the person was depressed. This picture shows a child drawing teepees with an airplane flying, shows the difference in cultures. Oh, please. Some of the other things we use is the collage, where it is cutting and using pictures and letters from used magazines or old newspapers and pasting and gluing them on paper. It was hands-on activity and was therapeutic for the individuals, helping them to focus in a less threatening way than talking. Both art therapy and collage were therapeutic. They help people process their feelings and thoughts. Here is an example of a worker in a training session about collage, doing his own life story. One thing we believe is that people must participate in their own healing before attempting to help others. Joyce mentioned the historic things that happened to our indigenous people. In the 1940s and 1950s, tuberculosis invaded the communities in the north. A lot of people had TB and were taken from their homes to TB sanatoriums in the various parts of Ontario and Canada. Both children, young adults, and adults. Families were separated for long periods of time. My dad had tuberculosis. He was gone away and in a sanatorium for a total of 5 years before he came home. So I was without a father for that time. My oldest auntie and youngest auntie were also in the sanatorium in the 50s. My oldest auntie never came back, and we did not know where she was buried. Turn, please. Residential schools. Residential schools happened from the middle of the 1800s until the middle of the 1990s. A lot of families were separated, not by choice, before the 1970s. Children as young as 5 years old were taken away from their families, sometimes for many years. Children suffered physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. To this day, a lot of families are still impacted by the residential schools, causing intergenerational trauma. We have to take this into account when we are counseling people, to look at what someone's parents might have went through. I myself never went to residential school. My 2 younger sisters and 1 brother went to residential school. Those were the lonely years for me, my family, when my siblings went to residential school away from home. In the 60s, many indigenous children from infants or toddlers or up to the age of 16 were removed from their families by the child welfare authorities. This was called the 60 scope because it felt like a scope. Just like with mental health counseling, non-Indigenous workers did not understand how to work with our people to find out other alternatives. These children were placed in foster and adopted homes across Canada, the United States, and even across the oceans, usually with non-Indigenous families. Many of those children had parents who had gone to residential school and were suffering from its effects. Many of them suffer from the loss of their cultural and feel lost in the white world. This is another example of intergenerational effects of the schools. All of the above show example disrupted family unity, loss of language, culture, and loss of the land. This caused loneliness, separation, anxiety, depression, to say the least, and name a few. Today, our indigenous people are suffering trauma and loss, much of which originated from the impact of the residential school and the loss of culture. Some cope by using alcohol and drugs. At the same time, our indigenous people are resilient people. In the past, we acknowledged our loss, but kept moving on, and there were so many physical things to do to survive. Today we're trying to return to some of those ways. We are teaching our culture and land-based activities. We are teaching our children land-based activities, teaching them our culture and our language. We are training more people to be healthcare workers and social workers, and more of our young people are going to college and universities. We have taken control of service for us. First Nations are working with the government to improve our quality of life. We are on our healing journey. Miigwech, miwe. Thank you, Lydia Sherman.
Thank you, Lydia. Now we can move on to Sally.
Okay, my name is Sally Gagikamak Bunting. I am an elder from North Spirit Lake, Ontario, Canada. I was born in a small village in the northern Ontario, which at that time had no name. I was delivered in a small teepee to my mother, Nathan Ray, and father, Boyce Ray, on April 24, 1951. At the time, there was no clinics, hospitals, or buildings in the northern village I came from. There was no nurses or doctors to help with the delivery. We rely on solely on the support of elders and medicine men within the community. The small northern village is known today as North Spirit Lake. During the time we were living in the land, moving from place to place, looking for food, we would move to different places after about every 2-3 weeks. My grandparents were there to teach me all the things that I need to know to survive. Such lessons include hunting, trapping, fishing, cooking, smoking fish, and most meat, or any wild meat we would get. In the summertime, we would live off berries and other local edible plants. Some plants we would use as medicine to heal things such as cuts, constipation, pain relief, fever, and other cold and cold and flu symptoms. I lived with my grandparents because my mother passed away when I was 2 years old, and my father was living in Thunder Bay with an illness called TB, tuberculosis. My father passed away when I was 5 years old. I was 5 years old when I first went to residential school. It was very traumatic and culture shock for me because I never leave my community, my reserve, my home to go to a place that I do not know. The foreign place had foreign language and foreign food. I had to stay in the residential school for 8 years, in 1957 and 1965. In the summertime, no, what was that? Oh, I stayed up. Well, I stayed, but I never forget my language, which is Ojibwe. When I was 5 years old, I promised myself I would never forget my language because I know I needed to be able to communicate with my grandparents. When we came back from residential school, which was 2 months in the summer, most of the children forget their language. So when I was home, because I remembered my language, I had to interpret for other children, my friends and cousins to speak with their family and grandparents. In 1897, the first residential school was opened and the last one closed in 1996. The churches began to acknowledge their education schemes, which was specifically designed to kill the Indian in the child. After I returned home in 1971 and 1978, I learned the traditional ways of my grandmothers. One of them was the practice today as midwife, bringing new life into the world. At the age of 16, I was hired to be the first community health representative of North Spirit Lake because I know how to read, write, and speak English. This was a time before North Spirit Lake had community nurses and doctors. I was the first line of medical defense and relearning the traditional teachings of my grandparents to survive in my community. One of the responsibilities of a community health representative was to deliver babies. Through my first delivery, I had my two grandmothers by my side, coaching me every step of the way. The first baby I delivered was named Homer Mikas. When he was born, he was very ill, weighed only 4 pounds 5 ounces. The night he was born, he struggled to make it through the night. He was very dehydrated and had shortness of breath. The next day, an elder came to talk with the parents and shared that she had a dream about the baby boy that delivered the day before. The elder shared that within her dream, she was told the baby boy needed to be given to someone who was done through much loss in their life, to give him to give him to someone who has suffered loss and despair. The parents decided to give the baby boy to me. He is my elder son and currently serving as a band counselor of North Spirit Lake First Nation. I would be very happy to answer questions about how the elders were so important to our people in the past. In 1992, I was looking for outside help because of the physical abuse I was enduring at the hands of my husband at that time. In 1983, I got a job at the hospital in Sulcott as a mental health worker. Flying in and out of the communities, listening to victims, I worked with many doctors, psychiatrists, and learned a lot from the professionals. My world was very hard. I did not know where I belonged. I would go home to my community and then back to the outside world. For many years, I moved my family around, and my children were with me through my journey. In 1994, I became the first female chief of North Spirit Lake. I faced a lot of hardships as the leader of the community, as many men still did not approve of a woman in position of leadership. North Spirit Lake is a dry community, meaning no drugs or alcohol are allowed at that time. Addiction rate was at an all-time high, and I made it my mission to address the drugs and alcohol crisis in the community. Because of the abuse I endured at the residential school, I often felt insecure with who I was, but knew I needed to remain strong to lead my community. My life experience helped shape me to have a better understanding of community needs, knowing that I was not the only person from my community that survived residential school. So I made it my mission to help people with problems like mine, suffering from emotional, mental, spiritual, sexual, and physical abuse from the residential school. If I was going to help them, I had to help myself first, which was very difficult. We are always told to forgive, but I can never forget what I went through. And that is my goal still to this day, to never forget the painful past and to help the people who are still hurting today. Now at 72 years of age, I am currently working as an elder in Dryden High School to support students from the 6 Hiwaitan and Gogomakana communities achieve their high school diploma. The 6 northern communities that make up Hiwaitan and Gogomakana are Poplar Hill, Deer Lake, North Spirit Lake, Hiwaiwan, Fort Severn, and McDowell Lake. The students I support are young men and women age 13 to 21. My role is to incorporate culture, teaching, and language into the daily lives of our students. Also to share knowledge and help educate other high school students on our Hiwaitan ways, bringing awareness to what our people went through when they were taken from their community and forced to attend residential school as young children. I have I have been doing this job for years now, 8 years now. Within the last 2 years, I have really seen growth into my team, working, helping me bring my vision to life. My vision is to help rebuild the relationship between our First Nation people and non-First Nation people, to live in harmony together for our future generations, not to see the color of one's skin, but to acknowledge and appreciate our different cultures. I hope to help our students coming from isolated communities feel safe and comfortable during their time in Dryden. We are as a team trying to achieve this by remembering where they came from, acknowledging and appreciating that difference, more land-based lifestyle, not to change them, but to educate them while they are here. Daryl Norman and Rachel Thackeray are my co-workers and helping me through this journey. Okay. There are many things that I would say, but about my life. I hope that those listening will feel comfortable asking me how I have been able to use my life experience to help others. Miigwech. What is it? Okay, thank you.
私、映してないですか？これでもいいです。大丈夫です。ありがとうございます。はい。ジョイスさん、リディアさん、サリーさん、どうもありがとうございました。素晴らしいご報告だったかと思いますが、心の中でですね、大きな拍手が聞こえてきます。これからですね、短い休憩を取りたいと思います。実はですね、ジョイスさん、リディアさん、そして、サリーさんはですね、2、3ヶ月ですね、かけて、本日に向けて準備しているのではなく、本日もですね、現地のですね、時間帯は実は真夜中、夜のですね、12時を過ぎているというね、夜の0時を過ぎているということもありますので、ここでですね、予定通りに10分程度の休憩を取りたいと思います。日本の標準時間で14時40分、あと大体9分後に、ディスカッションに移りたいと思います。その前に休憩が終わりましたら、日本時間で14時40分より、対面会場の、松尾先生よりですね、してコメントしてのご質問をいただきたいと思います。ではですね、9分弱ゆっくりお休みください。 はい、皆さんお待たせしました。40分になりましたので再開したいと思います。お帰りなさい。ではですね、休憩を得ましてですね、最初はですね、10分程度、日本ソーシャルワーク学会国際委員で、淑徳大学のですね、准教授でいらっしゃいます、松岡奈先生よりですね、コメントと、報告者の皆さんへのですね、ご質問をいただきたいと思います。松尾先生はですね、話される言語は英語になり、日本語になりますが、こちらはですね、英語のスライドを映しますので、日本語については、話される言語と同じスライドについては、お手元の資料、事前配信資料をご覧になってください。ではですね、松尾先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ジョイス先生、リディア・シャーマン先生、サリー・バンディング先生、ブッシュ、こんばんは。そして、オンライン日本女子大学にお集まりの皆様、こんにちは。今日は遠く離れたカナダから力強いお話を聞く機会をいただきありがとうございました。私は本日の共催団体の一つである日本ソーシャルワーク学会で国際委員を務めている松尾香奈と申します。日本ソーシャルワーク学会はソーシャルワークの実践、理論の研究、教育を通じ、ソーシャルワークの実践及び理論のレベルの向上を図り、ひいては社会福祉の発展に資することを目的にしている団体です。ご発表を伺い、日本人の一人として、そして本務校である淑徳大学アジア国際社会福祉研究所が進めている仏教ソーシャルワーク研究のメンバーとしてコメントをさせていただきます。本日のお話の中から改めて多くの事実を知りました。当事者の方々のお話は気がつかなかった、忘れてはならない、ことを教えてくださいました。今日のお話はカナダ国内における異国、ホワイトたち、移住者たちの施策がインディジナスな人々を抑圧してきた事実でした。最初の事実は1880年から1960年代まで実に15万人の先住民の子どもたちが強制的に両親やコミュニティから引き離された生活を強いられたということ。そして植民地支配により先住民が土地や生計手段を奪われただけではなく、文化、言語、アイデンティティや人権まで奪われたということ。それからカナダ政府が過去の過ちを認識していること。いずれも重い事実として学びました。そして差別、深刻な貧困や精神衛生上の課題は未だ解決されずに存在していること。現在、文化に配慮した取り組みにおいて、先住民自身が積極的に声を上げ、牽引していること。母語、自分自身の言語を奪われることは、人々のアイデンティティを奪うことであり、言語の権利を剥奪する暴力を意識しない政策は、人々の生活ばかりか、存在を消してしまいかねないということ。人々の持つ文化や生活に根ざしていないメンタルヘルスケアでは意味がないということ。そこで生まれた疑問は、私は一人の日本のソーシャルワーク研究者として、アイヌの人々にどう振る舞ってきたのか、なぜ何も疑問に思わなかったのかということです。事実は知っています。2万年以上前に北海道に人類が住み始め、日本書紀や7世紀の日本の古い記録に、アイヌの言語につながりのある記述や薩問文化の記録が残っています。また、明治政府になって1899年、北海道旧土人保護法が制定されました。2009年7月、 教育やアイヌ文化の振興、産業振興を含む今後のアイヌ政策に関する基本的原則や広範囲な施策を提言する報告書が、英語の仮訳とともにインターネット上に公開されています。日本政府は1974年以来、北海道歌り福祉対策を実施しています。また、歌り対策の在り方に関する有識者懇談会が1996年に発足、97年4月に報告書が提出されました。それには、1993年、国際先住民年を契機に、日本政府は明確にアイヌの人々の人権を尊重を図るとしていましたが、日本国政府として日本の先住民が持つ問題をいかに取り組むかという議論については深まることはなかったと記録されています。この懇談会にはアイヌの人は入っていません。また、報告書はアイヌの人々の民族性として次のように報告しています。現在、アイヌの人々は我が国の一般社会の中で言語面でも文化面でも他の構成員とほとんど変わらない生活を営んでおり、独自の言語を話せる人も極めて限られた数にとどまるという状況に至っている。明治政府が優先的に日本語を教育した結果、どうなったでしょうか。今日のお話にあったように、母語の剥奪は人々のアイデンティティと尊厳を奪う暴力です。この認識を私たち非先住民は持っていたでしょうか。2008年、国会は政府に対し、アイヌの人々を先住民族として認識し、総合的な施策を構築することを求める決議を全会一致で採択しました。日本はアイヌの人々が日本列島北部周辺、とりわけ北海道に先住し、独自の言語、宗教や文化の独自性を有する先住民族であると認識しています。北海道は1972年から北海道アイヌ生活実態調査を8回実施し、報告書はインターネットで公表されています。2017年の報告のアンケートによると、重点的に対策を行うべき分野として、言語、祭事、舞踊が挙げられています。ただ、生活実態調査は北海道環境生活部で実施されており、社会福祉を管轄するセクションではありません。本当に社会福祉のニーズを含む生活実態を把握できる調査なのでしょうか。日本のソーシャルワーク研究者として、アイヌに対して私はあまりにも理解が足りなかったと反省しています。カナダの報告で、児童福祉当局が子どもを家族から引き離した歴史の事実は、ソーシャルワークが抑圧者になり得るということを示しています。これは日本のアイヌ人への対応を見ても明らかです。私が今日お話を伺って一番強く感じ、恥ずかしく思ったことです。反省は私自身でなされなければなりません。今日はこの貴重な機会に登壇してくださった先生方にご質問します。的外れな質問もあるかもしれません。どうぞお許しください。まず、ジョイス・ティンプソン先生にご質問があります。ソーシャルワーク実践者への研修は、日本においても実践者の育成にとても重要な意味を持っています。カナダの実践者研修では、先住民の皆さんに対し、ソーシャルワークによる抑圧を生み出さない工夫を共有することはあるのでしょうか。特にアイデンティティの喪失から生じるメンタルヘルスケアの場面で、先住民の皆さんと一緒に実践するときに心がけていることは何でしょうか。また、非先住民による抑圧について、和解と癒しを実現するために重要なことは何でしょうか。バンディング先生には、ぜひ伝統的な長老の役割についてもう少し教えていただきたいと思います。遠く離れた地域に住んでいるコミュニティの人々は、政府のソーシャルワーク機能へのアクセスが難しいのではないのでしょうか。生活上の困ったとき、長老たちに相談するのでしょうか。長老が女性であることの強みというのは何でしょうか。最後に、リディア・シャーマン先生に質問です。メンタルヘルスケアの研修を受けられたとき、ご自身が持っているスフィアの知との違いはあったのではないでしょうか。そして、シャーマン先生、バンディング先生のお二人に質問です。日本のソーシャルワークに関わる人々に考えなければいけないことがお話でたくさん出てきました。しかし、非先住民であり、抑圧者にもなり得る人々を先住民は許してくれるのでしょうか。 私の研究所の仏教ソーシャルワーク研究は2010年にアジア太平洋ソーシャルワーク教育学校連盟アパスエで始めたソーシャルワークの国際定義改定検討過程でアジアのソーシャルワーク研究者が主流である西洋ルーツのソーシャルワーク専門職教育 Western Rooted Professional Social Work WPSW と呼んでいますが、このソーシャルワークのグローバリゼーションへの疑問を持っていたことにあります。そして仏教徒のソーシャルワーク研究者がアジア仏教ソーシャルワーク研究ネットワークを作っていきました。仏教の演技、仏教経典の教えに基づき、僧院や信徒が実施しているソーシャルワークの機能を持っている活動を仏教ソーシャルワークとして記録してきました。そして2021年、仏教ソーシャルワークをインディジナスソーシャルワークとして位置づけ、修正 ABC モデルを発表しました。ソーシャルワークにはいくつかの形があるだろうというものです。それぞれの土地に根付いたソーシャルワーク、活動、実践がある。これが C です。ここの C は仏教僧院が発端ですが、イスラームでも様々な活動が見られています。宗教の一環として、またコミュニティの支え合いや互助としても存在しています。一方で産業革命以降、欧米の都市社会で培われたソーシャルワーク専門職教育があります。チャリティーから専門職業として進化を遂げた、いわば主流のソーシャルワーク教育です。これを Western Rooted Professional Social Work と位置づけます。A です。そして、この WPSW を先住民が実施する形というのもあり得るというのが A の形です。お話の中に出てきたソーシャルワークの中に各地域に根ざした形に変容するソーシャルワークとして、まさにですね、インディジナスなソーシャルワークそのものが地域社会の中で専門職業として実践されていく B-C、B の CK というモデルも見られたように私は感じています。あるいは欧米ルーツのソーシャルワークが各地域にローカライズ、あるいはインディジナイズされていく形とも言えるかもしれません。なお、ここでのインディジナスというのは、国連で定義されているインディジナスとは少し異なっているかもしれません。果たして仏教ソーシャルワークはインディジナスソーシャルワークと言えるのだろうか。今日のお話を聞いて、私は自分自身に今問い直しています。今日ご登壇いただいた先生方、そして集まってくださったオーディエンスの皆様にはぜひ教えていただきたく思います。たくさんのご質問をいたしました。貴重な時間をいただき心から御礼申し上げます。最後に私の属している研究所の英語の Facebook の QR コードを貼り付けております。もしよろしければどうぞアクセスしてみてください。ミーグイチ、Thank you very much。本当にありがとうございました。
はい、松尾先生、どうもありがとうございました。たくさんの質問いただきました。とても助かります。ではですね、これからですね、約25分を使ってこれらの質問にお答えしたいと思います。これからのですね、モデレーター言語は英語に切り替えたいと思います。Okay, so if we all could please turn our cameras and mics on, we would like to have a discussion. And I would like to start by answering these questions from Kana, if possible. I will just show the questions in order. So the first question was to Joyce. Are you guys there? Maybe you can turn your cameras on.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, it's off again.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
And is Lydia with us?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. If Lydia could also turn her camera and camera and mic on, and also Matsuo sensei.
カメラオンになってますね、リディア先生。大丈夫です。
大丈夫ですか？すいませんでした。ではですね、じゃあこちらのですね、今画面に映っているジョイス先生のですね、ご質問を、まずはですね、ジョイスさんに、答えていただければと思います。よろしくお願いします。
Okay. In Canada now, in the schools of social work, there are courses on Indigenous issues, on reconciliation, but also on the larger issue of diversity and equity. because Canada is an extremely diverse country. One of the aspects of the training is for what they call equity training, and it's to get social workers in training to examine their own biases, their own prejudices that are evident, but also they may not know about their bias, but they aren't aware of it. So looking at the self and constantly examining the self is a very important part in social work training. And also, in order for a worker to be a child welfare worker, now they have to take training in this before they can even start their jobs, which is far a great step forward from when I did child welfare.
Thank you, Joyce. If it's okay, I would like to move on to Sally's question, which is about the role of elders. If you could tell a little bit more about this, as can I ask?
Okay, traditionally, what is the role of elders in our spirit lake? The elders are there to teach culture, traditional ways of doing things, and they're the mentor of the whole community. And they're because of their elders, they are highly respected communities. When I was working, when you start working, because that's the elders, because they're really important. And the other one, and the other one is the difference between the leadership of model urban society. For example, do elders have any function to consult or to provide any social supports when people in the community are in trouble in leading their lives? That is a big part of like when I was a chief. Yes, I run the community. I do all the things one does to lead the community. But then the thing was, the elders were the ones that are give me directions. They're the ones who are the higher ups, higher than the chief. So they were there to guide us, to guide me as a new chief, to guide me and to see the vision of what I'm trying to accomplish. So, and that's what the elders are for. And they really, and what other things are okay, for the strength of the female elder, I am an elder. And because of my knowledge from living way back, and what I endured in my travel, and the pain and the suffering I went through residential school, with me, that's the strength itself. It's the strength itself for me as an elder, to be able to use that pain I endured to teach the young people and the people that are still suffering, to help them, because I went through it. I'm not talking about, if I didn't go through that, I don't think I would ever be able to tell people how to feel. But because I went through it myself, I was in the middle of all the pain and that's why it's easy for me to be the the strength that I have right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Sally. With that, I hope to move on to Lydia's question, which was about the sphere and how this differs from what you learned from more Western, more clinical training on the job. If you don't mind, I would like to show this sphere to the audience here so that they can see the actual figure itself. So Lydia, please, you can start answering the question and I will just switch the screen to the actual sphere to show the audience what you are talking about. Maybe the spiritual dimension would be very interesting for the Japanese audience, in my opinion, but also whatever you have to add to this question.
I guess it started off when we were working with mental health in the beginning, in the early 80s, when I wrote in my presentation that we worked with 3 elders, 2 females and one male, and how an elder talked about the wind, how the wind is, he used the wind as an example, where we don't see the wind, we don't see it, but we can hear and feel it. And wind can be destructive, and it can also be an advantage to us. We only see the wind on the ripple of on the water or the trees. He just used example of the wind. So he said when you work with a person, you're working with the whole being of that person, not just one part of the person. And he mentioned, so that when we work with a person, there's 4 aspects: the body, the emotion, spiritual, and the other one, I can't see the other one. Anyways, he said each person in their life, this is what they have. So when we work with a person, it's like a circle in their life. These are the 4 aspects each person has. You cannot just help one part of the person. You cannot help their physical. The body is physical. The emotional is feeling that we don't see what's inside that person. We need to work with the whole sphere of that person, the 4 aspects of this sphere. And sometimes these overlap. The body is in pain, the emotions, there could be tragic things that happen in their life, losses, intergenerational impact from residential school, grief. A lot of people, by the time they're in their 20s, they have lost maybe half a dozen people in their life that are close to them. So he said, when we work with an individual, concentrate on all these 4 aspects in the person's life, not just one, not just the mental, not just emotion, not just the body or the spiritual. We have to focus on all 4. Like he used an example, the doctor. Well, the doctor can examine the person physically and say, well, he has pneumonia, and he'll treat that pneumonia. He's able to assess and assess that person from the physical point of view. But our job as mental health workers, he said, we deal with emotions of that person. which impacts their spiritual and their body and their emotions. So we have to, sometimes we may not know what that person is carrying in their life. We don't know, and he said it's our job, it's our work to find out what they're carrying, what emotions are they carrying in their life. Is it a loss? Is it grief? Is it depression, anxiety? Why are they depressed? Why do they have anxiety? Why are they what's the cause of grief? And he said in order for the person to heal, it's going to take time to heal from all those four. It's easy, he said, it's easy to treat physical pain, maybe a broken finger, a burn, because a doctor can see that, we can see that. But the emotional pain, the spiritual pain, we don't see. And that's where we come in, he said, to find out what is causing those emotional and physical, spiritual issues in their life. We have to work with that person, and it takes time. It's a process. Healing will take time. He said healing is not going to happen right away. It could be a year. Healing will not happen in a matter of time. And in order for a person to heal, he said, they have to be ready on their own time. Sometimes they're not ready, sometimes they are. When we started working, we worked with adults in the beginning in the 80s. As time went on, in the beginning of 90s, we started seeing young people, families, women, and men. And this was the impact. A lot of the result was from the intergenerational trauma from residential school. And the other one, we talked about tuberculosis. We talked about our families that were taken away and lived away from home for my dad, 5 years. He was away. And coming back, he had to adjust to be back in the community and with his family. And so this fear is when I work with an individual, I always remember what's the spiritual means of what they believe in. A lot of us up here in our area, a lot of our people go to a church, or they're traditional. They have sweat lodges, powwows, that kind of thing. And that's part of their healing. And the link to there's a link to all these. I'm sure we are aware of this, but that's what the elder talked about when we started working with people, using the wind as an example. How wind, we don't see the wind, and again I say, he said we don't see feelings. When we see a person sitting in front of you, he said, we don't know what they're feeling. We know they're sad or they're depressed, but where, why, where is the sadness coming from? And he said, it's for us to work with that person slowly and be patient and listen. Listen to your client when you see them. Listen, take time. It takes time for a person to walk through their whatever is in their life. It's a process. It's like another example he used was a block of ice. How there's a block of ice, we see a block of ice. Well, the block of ice doesn't melt just like that. It takes time for that ice to melt. That's the same way when a person is going through their trauma, their issue. It takes time for them to go through their issues. They're on a healing journey. The healing journey takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And again, when we see the circle, it can overlap, like the physical and emotion can overlap. A person maybe broke her arm and emotionally she's grieving, and you put it all together. I remember one time I went with a psychiatrist, and he asked the patient, he said, "How are you feeling?" And the client said, "It's my feet." And the psychiatrist said, "Well, how are you feeling?" And the client kept saying, "It's my feet." At that time, the pain that he was feeling was physical. And eventually he did come to talk about what he was feeling, and he was feeling the loss of his culture, that he could not hunt and fish anymore because that culture is lost today. It's slowly coming back again. We have land-based healing programs now in a lot of communities up north, where children and families go out and hunt in the summer and in the spring. And that's part of the loss, is the culture. And this is where emotions, a lot of times people talk about how the culture has been gone, it's lost. So we're talking about the emotion and physical and spiritual, how those are lost, and slowly we are regaining them.
Thank you, Lydia. Also, we really appreciate that you included many concrete examples for how to utilize the sphere, the medicine wheel. We have about 5 minutes left for discussion. It seems that we have received 2 questions from the audience, but I believe one of them was about training and supervision. So I think it was already been answered by Joyce. I think the other one is about restorative justice. I hope to forward this question to our presenters later. And if the person who asked this question is okay with it, I will be able to send an answer by email from our reporters, presenters today. That is because we still have a question from Kana, which is directed to Lydia and Sally. And it is about, well, it's basically about that social workers have a lot to answer for, I think, in this area. So Kana is wondering whether true reconciliation and true healing is possible. I would like to ask Lydia's and Sally's thoughts on this. Is it possible to truly reconciliate these historical traumas and heal from them? Maybe we can start with Lydia.
So reconciliation and healing in terms from the intergenerational trauma, mostly residential school. It's just beginning. About 8 years ago, there was a Truth and Reconciliation conference in Ottawa where they had, I think it was 96 recommendations. I don't have that with me right now. We cannot say it's done. It's still and will be ongoing, but it has started. And it's very complex, and it's very, it will take time for people to walk through the reconciliation and healing. There's still a lot of different healing, like healing, what do you call those conferences that are happening in communities? And I went to 2 weekends ago, I went to a residential school healing thing in the former residential school site north of Dryden, where former residential school survivors met and had a weekend of just sharing and healing together. And so it's happening different places, and there's another one happening June 26th, where there was a girls' residential school that existed back in the 80s, 70s. Joyce and Sally, I'm talking about Crystal Lake, where the girls' residential school was. And so it's only the beginning, and it will keep on going. If anybody has some more questions, they can either ask me later. But I guess what I've seen, what we have seen is that people are going back to the former sites, some former residential school sites to go and meet the survivors of residential school, and to be and to share and heal.
Thank you, Lydia. It maybe sounds strange, but I got the impression from your answer that if the abuse and the trauma took generations, maybe the healing process itself will take generations and the reconciliation to take place. However, I think Sally specifically mentioned about this in her presentation. So if she would like to add something to what Lydia has just said, I would like to ask her to do so, and that will conclude the discussion part of today's webinar. Please, Sally.
Yeah, okay, it's reconciliation and healing to realize. Well, for me anyway, because I'm the one, I went through the trauma and going through residential school. I think like what for me, I dealt with a lot of stuff, but then it keeps coming. Every time I hear somebody talking about what they went through, I can feel it. I know what they're saying. And now I have to train my grandkids about this, and then even though they see me as a strong person, it's still, sometimes it's really hard because all the things that was happening to me. The only thing they didn't take is my mind, and the reason why I kept not to forget my language. It was really helpful. and they took everything from me when I was there, and there's nobody could help, nobody can do anything. So this organization, the ones that are still alive, they really are struggling, and that's where I'm trying to help them to deal with it. But then, like I said, there's those flashbacks when somebody is still going through that and you're there with them. Even though, yes, we were told, you have to see the client, be there with them. And sometimes I would just want to sit there and cry with them, but then I have to be strong and to pull them away from that depression they are feeling because of what they went through. So it's going to be a long process. I'm 74 years old. I'm still trying to cope with all this. Okay.
Thank you, Sally. So with that, I would like to conclude the discussion. And once again, I would like to thank all of the speakers for participating and sharing their views and their teachings. I was wondering if maybe Matsuo Sensei, do you have any follow-up questions, or can we move on to the next part of the webinar?
「会長の方からオンラインでの質問が届いていたかと思うのですが、そちらの方
はい、ちょっと、yes, I will mention them later. Thank you. So once again, I thank you, Joyce, Lydia, and Sally. I understand that you're past midnight there. Yes, Sally still have a very important job at the very end to have the closing prayer. But with that, I would like to conclude the discussion and answering the questions right now. And with that, I would like to switch back to Japanese. では、改めましてですね、ディスカッションの部分ありがとうございました。ですね、質問はですね、オンラインで2つほどいただいているんですけれども、先ほども申し上げました通り、1つはですね、上司さんに多分すでに回答していただいているかと思います。なおですね、修復的、手法、正義、修復的対話に関する質問ですが、こちらについてはですね、後ほど報告者の方々にメールで転送したいと思います。よろしければメールでご質問をいただいた方にお答えできればと思います。ではですね、時間が参りましたので、これで閉会挨拶に移ります。閉会挨拶はですね、対面会場よりさせていただきます。こちらに関しましては、国際ソーシャルワーク協会副会長日本社会事業教授の小原真知子先生にお願いしております。小原先生、よろしくお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。聞こえますでしょうか？
はい、聞こえます。
はい。
Oh, Lydia, maybe you can turn your camera off as well. Oh, Lydia, you can turn your camera off if it's okay.
はい、ありがとうございました。国際ソーシャルワーカー協会副会長の小原でございます。閉会の挨拶をさせていただきます。今回のカナダにおける先住民ソーシャルワークの歴史的発展と進化する実践モデルのセミナーを開催できたことは、ご講演いただきましたジョイスさん、リディアさん、そしてサリーさんの3名の皆様のおかげでございます。心から感謝申し上げます。まず、先住民ファーストネーションの当事者であり、先住民による精神保健福祉サービスの立ち上げに取り組んでいらっしゃいましたリディアさんからは興味深いご報告をいただきました。先住民の方々の生活とご自身の歩まれた経験が手に取るように分かりました。同化政策において家族分離が行われ、寄宿制、学校生活を強いられたトラウマから生じる困難に対して、先住民ソーシャルワーカーが行う精神保健サービスに自らの文化と言語を用いて実践する必要性、それから先ほどお話がありました マインド、ボディ、エモーション、それからスピリットの、全体的な包括的なアプローチ、それからアートセラピーやコラージュ療法を用いて、トラウマに対する支援が効果的であることが理解できました。何よりも、ご自身の経験を含めてお話をしてくださり、本当にありがとうございました。それから、サリーさんからも、ご自身の経験から非常に興味深いご報告をいただきました。先住民としての生活の状況、その後の寄宿舎生活での生活が奪われたものが、その後の人生に与える影響についても、如実に語られておりました。サリーさんはご自身の経験をされたものをその後の人生に与えるものとして、本当に貴重なお話がありましたけれども、特にノーススピリット区の族長として、そして先住民の精神保健福祉ワーカーとしての仕事で生かしていらっしゃることには、先住民の持つ強さ、リジリエンスを感じました。サリーさんの先住民と非先住民が共に関係を構築して、未来の世代のために共に調和して生きていく、その語りに、共存していくためのこの認める、それから許す大切さ、これが未来の平和につながることを学びました。本当に貴重なご報告ありがとうございました。そしてサリーさんとリディアさんと共にカナダで初めて先住民の当事者ワーカーによる精神保健福祉サービスの開発に取り組み、長年にわたり先住民の精神保健福祉サービスに従事してこられましたジョイスさんからも貴重なご報告をいただきました。今日主張している私たちに先住民の当事者による支援のあり方とその意義を教えていただきました。同化政策が与えた子ども時代のトラウマがもたらす精神保健福祉の課題は現代社会にも通じるものかと思います。また、健康の社会的決定要因から先住民の方々に与えた影響、そしてそれをどのように打破するのか、その対応策についても語られました。先住民の当事者ワーカーとともに活動されているジョイスさんの長年にわたる取り組みは、ソーシャルワーカーとしてのモデルを示していただきました。本当に貴重なご報告をありがとうございました。さて、3人の皆様のご講演をお伺いして、まず浮かんだ言葉が、誰一人取り残さない社会を作るための社会政策のあり方、そしてソーシャルワーカーが担うべき使命を考える必要性を強く思いました。その上で3つのことをお伝えしたいと思います。まず1つに、世界には様々な地域、リージョンや国に先住民の方々がいらっしゃいます。今日お話していただいたカナダの先住民ソーシャルワークの発展の中で、これはカナダだけではなく、先ほどビラーク先生、それから松尾先生からもお話ありましたけれども、日本のアイヌ民族、それから琉球の人々も同じく、世界中の先住民が受けた苦悩があります。歴史的な植民地主義や同化主義の支配が及ぼした先住民の方々への影響が、いかに尊い人々の魂をも阻んでいくものであったかを、私たちソーシャルワーカーは理解する必要があるということです。これはその世代だけで終わることではなく、世代を超えて連鎖する根深い負担が存在し、それは幾世代にもわたって個人、家族、地域社会、そして、世界にも影響を与えていくものだからです。第2に、ジョイスさんが述べられていた健康の社会的決定要因の概念がありましたけれども、精神保健を捉え直していくことは有益であると思います。この概念は、先住民はもちろん、マイノリティ、移民、 難民などの健康状態を改善し、ごめんなさい。健康状態を改善し、公正な社会を実現するものとして非常に重要なものです。日本の先住民であるアイヌ民族に対しても、そして世界中の先住民に対しても、健康という概念は社会的決定要因から具体的に検討され、政策の中に反映されることを願います。それから3つ目です。ソーシャルワークの中でも多文化共生という言葉があります。この言葉は違いを認め合うことであることは否定いたしません。しかし私たちはそれぞれの違いを一つにまとめるのではなく、それぞれの違いの障壁はあっても、その違いが維持できる社会、つまり互いの違いをその空間の中で共生の空間として異なるものが対話して関係性を育むことができる共生社会、多文化共生の社会を社会政策の観点から、それから地域支援やミクロの個別支援からも改めて考えていく必要がありそうです。最後に私たちソーシャルワーカーは、ソーシャルワーク専門職のグローバル定義の中にある地域民族固有の地について、その背景と必要性を理解し、その地をリスペクトし、実践の中で先住民である当事者と共に具現化することが私たちの宿題であることをしっかり受け止めることができました。ジョイスさん、リディアさん、そしてサリーさんの3名の皆様のおかげでございます。私たちは深い学びができました。心から感謝申し上げます。また、開催のご準備にあたっていただきました皆様、そして今日ご参加くださったすべての皆様に心から感謝を申し上げます。最後になりますけれども、今回のこの企画は開会の挨拶でもありましたけれども、国際ソーシャルワーカー協会の設立記念の研究セミナーでございます。国際ソーシャルワークにご興味のある方、また一緒に研究や国際関連のソーシャルワークの活動をされたい方は、ぜひご入会をご検討していただければと思います。本当にありがとうございました。ミーグ・ウィッチ、Thank you。
はい、小原先生、どうもありがとうございました。最後にですね、冒頭と同じように、サリーさんに伝統的な開会儀式をお願いできればと思います。サリーさん、ご準備ができましたらよろしくお願いします。ご説明も含めてお願いします。
Okay, I'm going to pray that whatever we say is the truth, and that we're able to help you people across the ocean to know what we went through, and that hopefully it will help you with your work as well. So I'm going to ask God to, to keep his hands on all of us that are trainers or helpers, that we can, keep our mind into the things that we're trying to do, not to be prejudiced in anything that we do. So I'm going to ask God to help with that too. Okay, I'm going to pray now. Miigwish kajimando. Voyagem sahigag kabizandaw siyagi wagay kitiyan. Ono kaya na makingaya waj kago kenda mwaj. Iwan an kuiwan. Iwaj the jimin sinagay huwe. Iwaga kanahmawangaj. Waga winta mortgage wagij min sin. Mansit bir auye. Miguel Gejemando. Ihu ajam staigato tamokshan. Ihawin nagtiskay hawin nagkanazamin hawin nagabazan tamwaj. Gabazan dakshan. Tigo to tamwaj yuwen. Yuwen and kuigun yamajam aska and kuigun Gejemando. Kakanabuko hawin nagzamin. Yuwen nakikidyan. Amen.
ハリーさん、どうもありがとうございました。これで本日のセミナーは終了となります。改めまして、共催団体、講演団体、そしてすべてのご登壇の皆さん、またご参加の皆さん、そして何よりもですね、本日の通訳者の方々をはじめとした、こちらのですね、スタジオのスタッフの皆さんに、また対面会場のですね、運営スタッフの皆さんに、心よりお礼申し上げたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。心の中ではございますけれども、ぜひともですね、大きな拍手をですね、本日の皆さんにお送りしたいと思います。私はちょっとね、対面でしますけれども、皆さんは心の中でお願いします。続きましてですね、そしてですね、個人的にはですね、本日のですね、モデレーターの補助のですね、お務めてくださった日本ソーシャルワーク学会国際委員、ルーテル学園大学准教授の浅野先生にも、本日大変お世話になりました。どうもありがとうございました。これで終わりになります。本日は、対面会場の皆さんはですね、気をつけてお帰りなさい。そしてですね、特にカナダの皆さんはですね、遅いので、ゆっくりお休みください。これからの類似企画、よろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。